In this way, then, conscience acts and preserves itself in the unity of its essential and actual being, in the unity of pure thought and individuality. It is the self-assured spirit which has its truth within itself, in its knowledge, and therein is knowledge of duty. It maintains itself therein by the very fact that what is positive in the action, the content as well as the form of duty, and the knowledge of it, belongs to the self, to the certainty of itself. But what seeks to confront the self with an essential being of its own is held to be something not true, something stripped of its self-subsistence and only a moment. Consequently, what counts is not simply knowing in general, but conscience's knowledge of the circumstances. It places in duty as the universal in itselfness the content which it takes from its natural individuality. For the content is one that is present within itself. This content, in virtue of the universal medium in which it exists, becomes the duty which it carries out, and empty, pure duty, just through this action, becomes established as something not self-subsistent, as only a moment. This content is the canceled emptiness of pure duty or its fulfillment. But even so, conscience is free from any content whatever. It absolves itself from any specific duty which is supposed to have the validity of law. In the strength of its self-assurance, it possesses the majesty of absolute autarky to bind and to loose. This self-determination is therefore, without more ado, absolutely in conformity with duty. Duty is the knowing itself. The simple selfhood, however, is the in itself. For the in itself is pure self-identity, and this is in this consciousness. In paragraph 646, we're going to see Hegel beginning a progression that's going to run through the next several paragraphs, and actually really through the rest of the morality section, in which what's going to be coming to light, what's going to be revealed through the dialectic, is the fact that conscience can't really sustain itself in the way that it would like to. I mean, the paragraphs prior to this were in some respects almost like a triumph for conscience, right? And what we're seeing here is the pinnacle of that triumph, but it's actually going to turn out to be empty in certain respects. And where he's going to go from this has to do with bringing in the others. But first, we have to get to this emptiness. And it's happening at the very point where it seems like conscience has managed to monopolize morality. And this is a familiar movement. Actually, we should stop for a minute and dwell on this. Anytime that we manage to get ourselves in the course of this dialectic to what appears to be like a total win, a total triumph, a total resolution, there's always something lurking in the background that we missed. And it's really easy for the person of conscience to do this, according to Hegel. And Hegel, notice, he's not actually on the side of conscience. He's just charting out what's happening. So he says, in this way, then, conscience acts and preserves itself in a certain unity. And we're going to come back to that unity in a moment. I've got it charted here. Where I want to look at very quickly is the last part of this paragraph where he says that in the strength of its own self-assurance, it possesses the majesty of absolute autarky. Now that sounds, again, like a triumph, like a win, like conscience has dominated the scene. An absolute autarky. Now what is autarky? Autarky is self-sufficiency. And if we go back to not just, modern ethics, but we go back to ancient ethics, which was concerned with things like happiness and virtue, one of the central preoccupations that you see in Platonic ethics, in Stoic ethics, in Aristotelian ethics, in Epicurean ethics, is autarky, this capacity to suffice to oneself and to be able to call the shots in certain ways within the scope of one's life. And here we might say within the scope of what Hegel much earlier was calling the ethical substance. One becomes the ethical substance. So one is the autark. He says, the majesty of the absolute autarky to bind and loose, this self-determination is therefore without more ado absolutely in conformity with duty, which is what we've been charting out this entire time. Duty is the knowing itself. This simple selfhood is the in itself. And we'll come back to that in a moment. There's a few more lines after that, but I want to go through how we're going to get there. So let's come back to the start of this paragraph. In this way, conscience acts and preserves itself in the unity. Now here, there's a little bit of I won't call it a mistranslation, but it's certainly an interesting translation choice that's a little bit misleading on Miller's part, where he says the unity of its essential and actual being in the unity of pure thought and individuality. Now, the unity of pure thought and individuality, not a problem, but essential and actual being, what we'd expect to see there is Wesentliches and Wirkliches, right? This interplay that's been going on the entire time. But what Hegel's actually saying is it's an sich sein und für sich sein. So the unity of its being in itself and its being for itself. That's a little bit more typical language. And can you read that as essential and actual? Yes, I guess. But what's being emphasized here is being for itself, being aware of one's own self, which I suppose you can say is happening through individuality. Is the being in itself essential? Yes, I suppose in a certain way. More important here is pure thought being opposed to individuality, right? So what's the pure thought going to be here? The pure thought of duty, which is going to turn out to be ultimately empty. But here, it's being said to not be empty, because this unity is going on. And Hegel tells us what is it? Conscience is the self-assured spirit which has its truth within itself, in its knowledge, and therein as knowledge of duty. Now you might say, well, that sounds very abstract and very conceptual and very cognitive. Remember that what we're talking about here is not, knowledge in a pure speculative sense, knowledge of the universe or of metaphysics. Metaphysics in a certain way, metaphysics of morals, to use Kant's terminology, or metaphysics of human nature, an anthropology that's going on, a moral anthropology, sometimes what we call also moral psychology, which has metaphysical aspects to it as well. So what's the knowledge here? It's a practical knowledge. It's a knowledge not just of how we ought to act, but what duty is in this case. And so it's getting to define it. Conscience is getting to define it. The individual who is also sort of stepping into the shoes of pure thought is getting to define it. And it says, it maintains itself therein, in this unity, by the very fact that what is positive in the action, and we'll come back to that in a moment, belongs to the self, to the certainty of itself. Right? So the certainty that it possesses, and remember, we always have this dialectic going on throughout the phenomenology where we have certainty, and then we want to attain the truth of that certainty, and in the process typically lose that certainty, but gain the truth, and then we want to come back again from the truth and get that certainty back. And bringing those two together is very much like trying to bring together two magnets that are charged against each other, because they have the same charge, actually. And it's tough to do, isn't it, in Hegel's schema. But that's what's going on here. So we're going to have an opposition going on in a moment between, again, he says what's positive in the action, which belongs to the self, and then what seeks to confront the self with an essential being of its own. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first, what is positive in the action? Well, three things that have to do with duty. The content, Inhalt, of duty, circumstances, the particular thing that's being said we ought to do. It might be to make money so you can support your kids. It might be to sit down and do a lesson plan so that your students can actually understand what you're doing. Make some PowerPoint slides, because students sometimes want those, right? Even though it's not a very good pedagogical technique, students want to have slides sometimes. Or it could be, doing good to your neighbor, loving everybody. It could be any one of those things. That could be the in-halt of duty. And then we have the form of duty as well. And form and content are correlative, right? The form is something more universal. And, if you think about, we've talked about this quite a bit, Hegel is not just targeting Kantian morality here. There's all sorts of other Enlightenment moralities that kind of fit together into this. And we can also talk about, some religious moralities. The form is important. It's what allows us to say that there's a generalization going on, that it's not just me and my own particularities deciding, right? And then he brings in a third thing, knowledge of duty. Content, form, knowledge. The knowledge of the duty is something, he says, positive. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But let's talk about what the conflict is here. So he says that what is positive in the action belongs to the self, to the certainty of itself. What seeks to confront the self with an essential being of its own is held to be something not true, something stripped of its self-substance, and only a moment. Only a moment. Only something that's part of a larger whole, a larger gestalt, shape of consciousness, a larger back and forth of dialectic. Now, what is this that's confronting it? We might be tempted to go to our unity here and say, okay, well, what's actually confronting the self with an essential being of its own is this pure thought. But the pure thought has now been, you might say, taken up by the individual conscience, right? So where would this other essential be? It could be, and Hegel doesn't tell us at this point, right? But we could presume that perhaps it could be the claims of another person or group. Perhaps it's some other moral teaching about duty that the individual is saying, yeah, okay, I recognize that you have some good points there, but I'm not going to buy it because I get to decide. I am, to use the phrase going a little bit back, I am the autark, right? I am the one who is self-sufficient. So he goes on and he says, what seeks to confront the self. Now that implies a certain agency, right? With an essential being of its own is held to be something not true, something stripped of its self-substance and only a moment. So then Hegel goes on and he says, consequently, what counts is not simply knowing in general, but conscience's knowledge of the circumstances. And, here we could say, with any kind of morality, when you're teaching it, when you're confronting somebody with it, if you want them to actually follow it, there has to be a buy-in on their part. Buy-in meaning that they say, okay, I recognize this, I view it as valid, I decide that I'm going to incorporate it. I mean, in a way, we're kind of looking ahead to Sartre and his comments about, well, if you listen to the priest, it's you choosing to listen to the priest, right? We can say that Sartre inhabits a era in which this sort of thing has become a underlying norm for consciousness, according to him. That's a little bit of a digression, but also kind of an interesting thing to think about, is it not? So Hegel goes on and he says, what counts is not simply knowing in general, conscience knowledge of the circumstances. It places in duty as the universal in itselfness the content which it takes from somewhere. From where? Its natural individuality. And what is natural individuality? Well, we've encountered this plenty in the morality section, plenty before that. It is the circumstances of one's own life condition, where one is, right? All the things, presumably, not just having to do with, how old you are, location, things like that, but everything about you, your relations with others as an individual within a fabric. So your familial relations, for example. I have to take my guidance for what I need to do in terms of providing for family from my family members who may be different than your family members. I mean, we can still generalize about this, but that's where conscience is taking its basis. So he says it takes this content from its natural individuality. Why? The content is one that's present within itself. This content in virtue of what? The universal medium in which it exists. Now, what's the universal medium? Pure thought in this case, right? Again, we're still at this unity that's been held up and achieved at this point. He says this becomes the duty which it carries out. And empty pure duty, just through this action, becomes established as something not self-subsistent. So oftentimes we encounter duty as this imperious command falling on us. Now Kant, of course, tried to say, well, the categorical imperative, which you're all bound by, don't get to make any exceptions, and you better use, humanity treat humanity as an ends, don't use it as a means, and all. It's like it falls on you, right? It's something that's seemingly coming from the outside, but Kant says, no, it's coming up from within your own rationality. Hegel here is saying conscience can say, screw you, I'm the one who decides, not you, Kant. Not something that you're presumably finding in me. I get to decide. And I'll make the important decisions here. Thank you very much. So, now, is this a certain kind of stubbornness or obstinacy? In earlier stages, it would have been. But right now, this is what practical reason has led us to. This is a practical reason that goes beyond the Kantian paradigm. Does it not? Well, we'll see. So he goes on and he says, it becomes the duty which it carries out. Empty pure duty is established as something not self-subsistent, only a moment. This content is the canceled emptiness of pure duty or its fulfillment. But even so, conscience is free from any content whatever. Now, we just said that. Wait a second. Conscience has a content as an individual. Yeah, but conscience can decide what content is going to count as content. It can push some off into this emptiness of pure duty and then pick something else. So if I have to decide between, as we saw before, alternatives of should I love my neighbor, should I accumulate money so I can take care of myself and my family, should I follow this moral command that I'm actually ratifying particular content here, I'm the one who decides it. I am the conscience. I get to pick what is going to count for me. And he says, conscience absolves itself from any specific duty which is supposed to have the validity of law. Doesn't mean that it doesn't follow any specific duties. It just means that it gets to decide which one is going to have the validity of law. We come back to that phrase that I brought up. In the strength of its own self-assurance, it possesses the majesty of absolute autarky to bind and loose. This self-determination is therefore without more ado absolutely in conformity with duty. Duty is the knowing itself, the simple selfhood. However, it is the in itself, for the in itself is pure self-identity, and this is in this consciousness. Now, Hegel's not saying, here's where the slide begins and the downfall starts, but that's actually what's happening here. Whenever we have something that is at this stage of the in itself, right, and we have something like pure being or something that just is the way it is, expect there to be some unpacking and some dialectical advancement past that. This pure knowing is immediately a being for another. For as pure self-identity, it is immediacy or being. But this being is at the same time the pure universal, the selfhood of all. In other words, the action is acknowledged and therefore actual. This being is the element whereby conscience stands directly in a relation of equality with every self-consciousness, and the meaning of this relation is not an impersonal law, but the self of conscience. Paragraph 647 is one of those short but very dense and important transitional points. As we just saw in the previous paragraph 646, we have conscience as being this individual and also unity with the universal, able to decide for itself which duties it's actually going to take on. He uses the word autarky there, self-sufficiency. And what we're going to see now is that very self-sufficiency, that very way of understanding itself, is going to yield us something quite different and bring us back into the world of others. And he uses this term, being for others, in the very first sentence. So let's start there, and we'll say, well, who are those others in just a moment. So he tells us this pure knowing. What pure knowing? The pure knowing of whatever it is that conscience knows. Its duty. It's the positivity of its duty in terms of content and form and knowledge. All of that stuff that at the very end became in itself a pure self-identity. This pure knowing is that. And he says it's immediately a being for another. Now he's going to use this word immediacy twice here. And part of it is by way of explanation. He says, for as pure self-identity, it is immediacy or being. So let's actually start with that. Pure self-identity. Sich selbst Gleichheit. Literally, you could say pure self-identity, you could say equivalency to itself, equality to itself, exchangeability for itself. It's all the same, right? In whatever differentiation it has, it's still just what it is. It's in itself. That's going to be immediacy, which is a way of translating Unmittelbarkeit, which we might translate a little bit more literally as a lack of mediation. And what is a lack of mediation? Well, there's two senses here, right? So mediation would be something in between two things, a third thing in there. And mediation is provided in Hegel in a number of ways. It can be within the same thing, where it suddenly becomes more complex, and one part or one moment of it is mediating another moment, sometimes displacing it, sometimes downplaying it, sometimes actually destroying it in some respects, destroying it sort of by analyzing it and showing it's not what it really is. But another way of mediation, which is going to be applying here, comes from other people, comes from another in this case, Gleichheit, another self. And this is where he's going, right? If we look at the last part of it, he talks about self-consciousness. And now, why is self-consciousness important? Why do we care about the fact that instead of just saying conscience or consciousness, he's saying self-consciousness? Well, let's think back to that section and try not to just, imagine the master-slave dialectic, but think about what came before the master-slave dialectic and what we learned about self-consciousness there. First of all, we learned that human consciousness is self-consciousness. And self-consciousness isn't something that exists all by itself the way that consciousness at least pretended to. It exists in relation to another self-consciousness, right? And actually, Hegel's being rather abstract there. It doesn't just exist in relation to one other self-consciousness. It exists in relation to a whole bunch of self-consciousnesses. This is what it means to have a culture. This is what it means to belong to a group. This is what it means to develop as a human being in concrete ways from a little tiny baby, learning all sorts of stuff as a kid and being, inheriting and sometimes questioning and fighting against, but also taking in all sorts of things that have to do with morality, right? And we should point out here, we're going to come back to this self-consciousness thing in a minute. This pure knowing, this is a practical knowledge, right? It is not a purely theoretical or speculative knowledge. It is about Handeln, which is behavior, how we act, our actions. And it's about duty. And it's also about something very important. So here we come back to thinking about self-consciousness again. What is it that self-consciousness really, really wants? You might say, well, to know itself. Yeah, okay, that's important. To eat, that's also important. To do the right thing, yes, that's nice too. To understand the absolute, great. But what else? What is it really, really after? What got us into the master-slave dialectic? What was the master looking for and set him or herself up in such a way as to not get it from the slave? And then what was consciousness, self-consciousness, looking for over and over again, not just through the rest of the self-consciousness section, but through reason and the rest of this spirit section? The German word for it is anerkennen. And what is the translation of that? Recognition, right? Acknowledgement. The two words that Miller uses over and over again, kind of, swapping them out every once in a while, maybe so we don't get so bored, is acknowledgement and recognition. They're the same thing. Anerkennen, here it's being used in terms of a verb, anerkannt. What is it talking about? Our action, our Handlung, our behavior is acknowledged and therefore actual. We'll come back to that in a minute, because what's the relationship between being acknowledged and being actual? That's an interesting question. But what's happening here is there is an acknowledging going on between self-consciousnesses. Is this going to be stable? Is this going to be an achievement that we hold on to? How do we get there? So we start with this pure self-identity and immediacy. And whenever we have an immediacy in Hegel, you know that, within a couple sentences, it's not going to be immediate, right? And he says, but this being is at the same time the pure universal, which is a being for another in this case. Now, the pure universal, what's the pure universal? Is it the being of beings? Nope. It is a being of human beings. It is what earlier on we were calling the ethical substance. Hegel doesn't use that term here, but that's what we're talking about. Now, what's a human universal? Well, what's universal to us human beings? Rationality. Is our rationality pure? Not by a long shot. And I don't just mean in the respect that it's also practical. It's also, something that's individuated and requires us to engage in all sorts of development and all that. But in this case, it's the pure universal. And what is the pure universal? Is it goodness itself or something like that? No. It's something different. The selfhood, Selbstheit, of all, or of everybody, or of every single one. Alles. So the universal, I'm the universal deciding for myself as conscience. I'm going to take on this duty, and I say, I don't care what duty you take on. I get to decide for myself. This is the one that I really like. I'm going to be a parent. I'm going to be a professor. I'm going to be this, right? Well, everyone gets to do that in the pure universal, right? And what ends up happening, at least for a brief shining moment, as we say, is the action of myself is acknowledged and therefore actual. What does that mean? Hegel goes on to say, and we're going to come back to this actual in a moment, that what we have here are, here he says, this being is the element whereby conscience stands directly in a relation, Beziehung, of equality with every self-consciousness. And the meaning of this relation is not an impersonal law, but the self of conscience. It is how I get to understand who I am. It's no longer immediate. It's being mediated by the other and this recognition. And I'm supposed to do that for them as well, right? So he says, a relation of equality. I wanted to dwell on that for just a moment, right? Because a relation of equality is a Gleichheit. Gleichheit, equality, equivalence, exchangeability, you could even say. Well, where did we see that? Sich-Selbst-Gleichheit. So we're moving from Sich-Selbst-Gleichheit to a Gleichheit that's in relation, Beziehung, connection with others. So this is how my conscience becomes ratified, takes on reality, you could say. Now let's come back to this. Therefore actual, right? Wirklich. Isn't my action already wirklich? I'm an individual, I'm doing things. Even if nobody else sees it, even if nobody else acknowledges it or recognizes it and recognizes me, it's still real, right? Yes and no. It's real, but it doesn't have the full human significance of something that has, in fact, been acknowledged. Hegel's onto something here that's quite important about human actions. It's not just that they're intentional. It's not just that they can be motivated by duty or against duty. It's not just that we choose them. It's also that others, in some respect, have a relation to those other actions, at least in principle. They can look at them and say, oh, you're doing a good thing there. Or, oh, what the hell are you doing? I don't understand that at all. Or, ooh, bad thing to do there, buddy. That is part of the significance of human action. And so what we're seeing here is it seems like conscience has now expanded itself into this harmonious community of all, something like what Kant calls the kingdom of ends in his works. Now we're going to see whether that it can actually stay like that or whether this is a transitional moment, as I was saying earlier.